Hi guys, this section will review diagramming for market failure. Please follow along with all series at home. Okay, so to start off, we know that market failure takes some of the traditional diagrams and changes them in order to see how the free market does not always efficiently allocate resources. So there'll be diagrams that you're familiar with, but we're going to get some new names and some new labels. Don't panic. The first thing we need to know about is the difference between social and private curves. Oh, every time I do that, I disappear. So for starters, we have a curve that looks pretty similar, right? You might call this a demand curve, right? We have a market for, say, a good X and a downward sloping curve. So in this unit, we're going to call demand curves marginal private benefit curves. It's a long name, so we're going to say MPB for short. And what does marginal private benefit mean? Well, for starters, marginal, right, we go back to unit 1, means the change, right? So we can see the change on the demand curve, right? Marginal, the next unit, how much utility does that consumer get from that good or service? Then private, meaning the consumer, here, private, and benefit, right? Which is another word for utility, right? For how much utility this private consumer gets from this good or service. Okay, we got that? So it's pretty similar to the demand curve, except for now we're going to call it MPB. Yeah, you know me. Okay. Now we're on to differentiating between private benefit and society's benefit, right? Which is like kind of the major theme of market failure, right? That we're not going to see just looking at the consumer and the producer's impact, but how does that affect the rest of us? Okay. So we're going to divide these curves into private benefit, which we already looked at in the last slide, right? So that's the consumer. And then here, for this instance, we're going to have it below. It's going to be the benefit of all of society. Okay, so we're going to call this the MSB, or the marginal social benefit curve. And that means how much does all of the good or service benefit, or consumption of that good or service benefit all of society? So I have an example here of one good or service, which is cigarettes, which is a pretty commonly used example, right? Because they have very different personal and social benefits, right? A benefit could also be utility, right? Because I don't think the smokers really benefit, but they think they do, right? So we can have the private smoker thinks they benefit from smoking, right? Each maybe different, the quantity of cigarettes. We know we have diminishing marginal utility, but the smoker thinks they benefit this much here, our line in blue, right? But for every cigarette that's consumed, that affects society as a whole in a negative way, right? So let's say someone's smoking next to me, or we all have to pay for the health care for smokers, perhaps, depending on where you live. So the marginal social benefit, or how much society benefits from that cigarette, is a lot less, right? And which is why we're going to have, for this example, the marginal social benefit is below the marginal private benefit, right? We get less per, if we look at the price line, right? Less per consumption. Right? And this is just a way that we can show how goods or services don't just affect the people that consume them, but they affect all of us, right? And we can make economic arguments using these. Okay. So that's from the consumer's point of view. In the next slide, we'll talk about the producer's point of view. So for producers, right, we don't just think about benefit, but we think about how much does it cost them to produce something. Okay. So we have the marginal private cost curve, which is how much does that private firm pay, right? What's their cost per unit, right? They produce a little, their costs will be low. As they increase the quantity of the good or service, their costs will increase. Now, obviously, in real life, this might be a sloped curve, but we're going to use just a line just to be easy, right? So the marginal private benefit, or MPC, means how much does that good or service cost the producer to produce that good? But, right, we know that society doesn't always pay the same price for the firm's actions. So if we want to see how a good or service, when it's produced, affects all of us, right, we can divide these two curves into our private benefit, as we saw before, and then similarly social benefit, or private cost and social cost. Rewind on that. So my example here is a factory. We can see it's emitting a lot of pollution. So for that factory, for every whatever tire or something they produce, right, they pay the costs of production, but society, for this example, is going to cost them more, right, because they are paying environmental costs, perhaps overall cost of climate change, or costs might be difficult to measure, right? People might ask, how do you know how far these curves are away? The scientists will have, and economists will have estimates, right? But we'll never really be sure how far away these curves should be. So the MSC, right, shows how much does this good or service, when it's produced, when it's being made, right, cost society. Okay? So we'll use either looking at consumption or production to think about how do these goods or services not just affect the consumer, but everybody else around them in our next unit, which is looking at the existence of externalities as a market failure. Please stay tuned and make sure you can answer the question on the next slide for practice. Thanks. We distinguish between social and private costs and benefits in order to show ... Can you explain it?